Podcasts should be in the penthouse. Just because you started it in your basement, you don't have to stay there to be authentic.
The industry is maturing, but it's also bringing in more mainstream media content consumers, and the content's changing and evolving to adapt that. It's a chicken egg thing.
We just had our big yearly convention in Las Vegas, eBay Open, and we had an open booth there, and we gathered hours and hours of content with sellers sitting down and telling us their seller story.
Podcast movement last year or the year before was maybe 25%. People of color, that's certainly risen this year.
Hey, it's E.B. Moss. I'm head of content strategy at MediaVillage, and this is episode 39 of Insider Insights. You're going to hear a little bit of some ambient sounds as we get into this podcast because I recorded it while I was in the halls of Podcast Movement 2019. They're back this year for the biggest version of the show yet. There were about 3,000 people in Orlando, all talking, showcasing, figuring out the world of podcasting. I grabbed some people, some really smart people, pretty spontaneously, and they did not disappoint. Here's who you're going to hear from. First was a content creator, the co-founder of Tenderfoot TV, Donald Albright. The research wonk, Tom Webster, was back from Edison Research. A brand marketer, I talked to Doug Smith of eBay about their branded content. The Pundit, the research consultant and advisor in podcasting, Steve Goldstein from Amplify. And finally, the female advocate for the women's podcasting space, Jessica Kupferman of She Podcasts. So first up is going to be Donald Albright of Tenderfoot TV.
I'm E.B. Moss for MediaVillage, which drives the business of media, marketing, and advertising forward through content by, for, and about thought leaders in ad tech and ad agencies, the audio space, and addressability, even those who are advancing diversity. So, let's get some insights.
As promised, I grabbed a really smart person here in the halls of Podcast Movement to kick off episode 39. Donald Albright, along with Payne Lindsay, co-founded Tenderfoot TV, which is the home to big shows like Up and Vanished and Atlanta Monster. They've amassed more than 430 million downloads for their 6 different podcasts. Donald's going to tell us all about it. Hey, Donald.
Hey.
Thanks for letting me grab you.
Oh, of course. No, I appreciate that you even want to talk to me.
Go ahead, drop some names because you have some impressive shows.
So Up and Vanished was our first show. We then partnered with How Stuff Works, and we did Atlanta Monster, which is a very chilling podcast that really received well, and something that I'm really proud of that work. Last year we partnered with New York Times bestselling author, 10-time bestselling author Neil Strauss to do To Live and Die in LA. That was our biggest breakthrough hit this year. And our current podcast, which is doing really great, is Culpable. So mostly true crime podcasts. We're going to branch out a little bit later on this year and in the coming year and a half to do more content that's still storytelling in long form, but not just true crime.
So why I wanted to talk to you is you have an interesting background, and Payne, your co-founder, and you were both in the music industry, and then you came into podcasting about 4 years ago or so. So really meteoric rise, but obviously you have some good production chops to your credit.
Yeah, I think the music industry experience helped a lot. I mean, my background is marketing, promotions marketing, and management. So finding talent and then knowing how to put out products and brand them well, market them well. Payne is a creator, short form docs, music videos. So we connected in the music industry. Kind of both got burnt out at the same time and decided let's do something different. He wanted to get into the TV world, which is why the name is Tenderfoot TV. But our stepping stone to get to TV was actually podcasting. And what we found, in this, in that 3 years is that the podcasting industry was actually the home we didn't know we wanted. And we, have made a home here in this industry and still doing TV. We're adapting some of our titles to TV. but the creativity and the freedom that we have in podcasting is like no other. So we're here to stay.
So you've seen some things change, and obviously things have changed for Tenderfoot TV. Like we said, meteoric, yay.
Yeah.
But the theme I think that I want to talk about throughout Podcast Movement this week is the more things change, are they staying the same? So what do you think? So let's talk year to date. We were both here last year at Podcast Movement. It seems like a much bigger show.
Yeah.
But about the industry, aside from growth, what have you seen change?
Well, the one thing that to me was one of the biggest voids, or where the industry could improve, was marketing and advertising. Not advertising in terms of how you bring advertising into your show, but are we advertising these shows to the public and marketing these shows in a way that makes them important, feeling important? So I felt like the industry was in its infancy in marketing and putting shows on a big stage. Not just touring in the big stage, but like from billboards to radio advertisements, TV advertisements. We have a TV campaign going right now on TNT for To Live and Die in LA, national TV campaign.
Yes.
So we want our shows to be seen and people to say, wow, that looks great. I want to go watch that TV show. And they say, oh, wait, it's a podcast. Like, value podcasts the same way you do TV and film. So I think that is changing. I think I see a lot more marketing efforts when I have conversations with my friends at iHeart and Cadence 13. The things that they want to do, they're starting to get a chance to do. And I think money is obviously a big obstacle.
Right.
We have to grow the industry so that we can grow our brands. And I think that brings us kind of into the advertising conversation, which is the main way that we fund our shows and our campaigns. So the industry has to grow, but the advertising revenue has to grow as well, so that we can go do these bigger budget marketing campaigns and take this entire industry to the next level.
Yeah, I think that's really well put. And you did mention Cadence 13 and iHeart, and I know that two of your big shows, you work with each of them respectively. And of course, Cadence 13 was just in the news for being acquired by Entercom. So that, I think, represents a little bit more of that infusion of cash and belief in the space as well.
Yeah.
And how much growth is left for us?
Oh, man, I think, I don't even know if we can imagine how big this can be. If you look at, where TV and radio are, we're not infants anymore, but we're toddlers still. We haven't even scratched the surface of what podcasting can be. So if we look at just, I think what are 600 million annual revenue, I think it is, in advertising this year's projected. I mean, when the big brand advertisers come in a big way, and that will affect CPMs, maybe that will affect how we present advertising, but we have to, as creators, we have to understand that it costs a lot of money to make these shows. The shows that we make, it's 12 to 18 months of investigation, original score and sound design.
With true crime.
Crime,
right.
Storytelling, narrative shows, serialized shows, they take a long time to make, take a lot of money to make. So we have to, not be so guarded with, trying to keep this industry in the basement, and say, look, this podcast should be in the penthouse. It doesn't have to be, just because you started it in your basement, we don't have to stay there to be authentic. We can, the music industry is thriving. It went through a phase, and now it accepted digital. It accepted how, the low bar of entry. It found a way to monetize it, and we need to do the same in podcasting and, create an industry of celebrities, an industry that is respected. Because one thing I see when adapting podcast to TV is that people still don't respect the podcast industry. And I think it's because we're like, if we have a show that we're adapting to TV, they don't always want to take that show and tell that backstory as a podcast, because they don't feel that enough people know about podcasts, or enough people will relate to that. So they'd rather, relate that to a radio show because more people know about that. Well, we have to get out of the old mentality of what podcasting was 5 years ago and into what it's going to be in 5 years. And for the creators and the studios and the networks that aren't on that page, they're probably going to get left behind, because the industry is going to grow with or without you. So let's all get on the same page and figure out, how do we make Podcast Movement 10 times bigger? That means it's going to cost 10 times more, probably, right?
And it'll eat CES's lunch someday.
Exactly, right.
Right.
Or how can you be a bigger part of CES and NAB and all these other conferences and where podcasting should really be at the forefront versus like the stepbrother of radio.
Love
you know
that
what I mean?
vision. Yep, good plan. All right, that I for somebody that I grabbed in the hall and said, "Hey, let's have this conversation, Donald." You give good spoken word.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and to all the readers.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If you've been a regular listener to Insider Insights, which I hope you are, you've heard me speak with Tom Webster before, and I love speaking with him because of the way he speaks to audiences at conferences all about research. He's Senior Vice President of Edison Research, and he really makes the numbers come alive. He had some really great takeaways for those in attendance at Podcast Movement 2019, and here he's going to recap some of those thoughts. So, Tom, hey.
Hey.
That was, I think you outdid yourself this time around. It was great.
It's all downhill from here.
Well, we bumped into some friends in the hall as I was pulling you onto the microphone. And as I said, when the research guy can have the audience in stitches, that's pretty good.
Yeah, I've been presenting numbers for like 25 years, and if you don't figure out a way, it's deadly.
Yeah, exactly.
You'll kill people,
So one of the things that I've been talking to people about here at Podcast Movement 2019, which is amazing, at like triple the size that it's been, I think, is the more things change, are they staying the same or changing?
They're changing. They're changing, and for internal reasons and external reasons. And for the sort of internal forces, there are a lot of different platforms with podcasts on them now that aren't necessarily podcasts, right? I mean, a podcast technically is on demand and it's downloadable and things like that. But first you have entities like Spotify and Pandora, kind of streaming podcasts, so they're still on demand, but they're not downloadable. And now we have entities like iHeart that's going to actually broadcast podcasts on their radio stations, which are definitely not podcasts at that point. So what's happening is it's socializing the term and the concept to a greater extent. It's going to attract more people, I think. But it's also, I think, going to create some real confusion about what is and isn't a podcast.
It's so interesting because we already are challenged in terms of metrics and measurement and listens versus downloads and this and that. So it's just going to add a lot of joy to the world of advertising.
Yeah, I don't know about joy, but it's going to give us some interesting dilemmas, right?
Yeah.
If a show has 10 million downloads, but also 10 million views on YouTube, is that 20 million people? I don't know what you do with that. So it's going to create some metrics challenges for sure.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of YouTube and or downloads or listens or wherever you are, you said a few key things in today's presentation, that you have to be everywhere, live everywhere, and love everywhere, because the audience these days, and I quote, they're like feral hogs, and you can't pen them.
You
anymore.
can't pen them. Yeah, you can't. I think in the early days of podcasting, it was easy to just sort of corral them into iTunes, right? Subscribe to us on iTunes. But increasingly, as people new to the space are coming in, they're coming in on platforms where that makes no sense at all, right? They might listen to a podcast on Facebook. They might watch a video on YouTube of a podcast or of something that isn't a podcast that they think is a podcast, right? So, kind of the marching orders, I think, have changed, and I think the only way to win at that is to have your content everywhere, but have it native to that platform, right? So we don't have to say things like subscribe to us on iTunes, iHeart, Spotify, Pandora, Stitcher, wherever you get your podcasts, right? That we can just say, like, I know you're watching this on YouTube, so click the subscribe link below the video, or I know you're seeing this on Facebook, follow our page.
Brilliant.
And sort of embrace natively the platform, differentially where your content is sent.
Well, it's interesting because that's always a best practice of content, and hence the word native became such a thing. And then it also is best practices with social media, where you don't just retweet or put on Facebook what you wrote for Twitter. So it is content best practices and marketing best practices. So it almost sounds like a sign that the industry is gaining some maturity.
Oh, I think that's definitely true. I mean, a third of the country are at least monthly listeners of podcasts, and that I would expect that number to continue to rise as it has been. And again, the term is being socialized in a lot of different ways. So the industry is maturing, but it's also bringing in more mainstream media content consumers, and the content's changing and evolving to adapt that. It's it's a chicken egg thing, but you have a lot more real mainstream content in the space now than you had 10 years ago.
Any quick stats you can throw at us in terms of the uptake year to date?
Yeah, so one thing that we found pretty interesting in our Infinite Dial study year over year, it was the largest percentage point increase in podcast listening across the board that we have seen in the 14 years that we have tracked it in the Infinite Dial.
Wow.
So monthly users went up from 26% to 32%, and weekly went from 17 to 22%. And so these are significant jumps year over year, and those jumps were helped by alternate platforms. I mean, Spotify had a big reason for especially on the young end. There were a lot of younger people introduced to podcasts because Spotify really started to feature them, and Pandora now is of course increasing their footprint in podcasting as well. So and those are big, broad, mainstream platforms. So that's just going to continue to expose people to the medium.
Fascinating. Tom Webster, once again, thank you very much. Great
pleasure.
insights. Well, I grabbed a good one. I was at the panel on branded content, and I was listening to Doug Smith from eBay talk about their transition from their long-term radio show to a branded podcast. So I grabbed him. Hello,
Yes.
Doug Smith.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thanks for grabbing me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm so happy to speak with you. At MediaVillage, we talk a lot about eBay as a media company, so I'm getting it a little bit from the horse's mouth.
Oh, good.
Yeah, so
All right.
thank you. I'll tell you what, since most people who are listening to this podcast weren't lucky enough to be in the room
Sure.
of your panel,
Sure.
can you just give us a little top line of how you described the eBay branded podcast?
Sure. So the eBay for Business podcast is one of our primary seller engagement tools, and it's part of the eBay community, and it's where we reach out to sellers. We tell seller stories. We gather internal eBay experts who talk about their areas of expertise, but it's also a very pertinent medium for the sellers. It's done on a weekly basis, and it's almost up to the minute news. And then, like I said, they get that internal perspective from eBay. They hear from other sellers. Sellers love to hear from sellers. And then, besides the news, there's also we have feedback to sellers from the feedback loop to kind of show them that they're being listened to. So it's called the voice of the community.
Oh.
And so our online community, it's basically each week we take a look through our metrics and we see what topics are being talked about at a high level. So some of the same topics do come up over and over, and we pass that feedback or those suggestions or those questions or those issues onto the teams at eBay. And so what we also do in the podcast is we have a segment where we basically say, hey, here's what's being talked about on social, here's what's being talked about in the community, and here's what we did in the community. Usually it's we engage, we answer questions, we pass feedback on to the teams. So it's important for sellers to hear that they are in that feedback loop, and this is really one of the few places that they get that.
I love that because it really is creating that holy grail of engagement.
Sure, definitely.
And the more a listener or a user, a buyer, a seller, what have you, touches your product, engages in
Sure.
another way. So it's really great content marketing at its purest form, it sounds like.
Yes, definitely. And we do involve the seller community, and I think eBay was founded on community, and community is such a part of what eBay is, that seller community, the literal and the virtual. So, and these the sellers are so passionate because eBay changes lives, it builds livelihoods, and these are the seller livelihoods that they're talking about. So they're very passionate, and we include them on a weekly basis. We just had our big yearly convention in Las Vegas, eBay Open, and we had an open booth there, and we gathered hours and hours of content with sellers sitting down and telling us their seller story, because every seller has a story. Every item they sell has a story. When they source, that's a story, and they're just they tell and share these stories, and sellers love to hear it.
Oh, it's great. It sounds a little bit like a touch of Antiques Roadshow or Cash in the Attic and those kinds of stories that we love to hear about.
Sure.
That's great.
Yeah.
So a little bit of the theme that I wanted to have for this episode of the podcast here, a podcast movement, was about how the more things change, the more they stayed the same? Making it a question.
Sure.
What do you think?
Well, I think for eBay, we've really evolved as a platform, and so it's important for sellers to evolve as well. And we always push that sellers need to think of themselves as a business. And the e-commerce industry has changed as well. So what we try to do, in all the things we do, is just make these recommendations to sellers that we think are best practices, and you need to do this, and the way we set up our searches, and you have to think of yourself as a business, but you have to think of a modern buyer that's going to be on mobile, that's going to look at a picture, and that first picture they see is one of the most important things of your listing, because they'll have other choices they can scroll down to. And then the other thing to always keep in mind is the market has changed too. Stuff that used to sell might not sell as much now. So sellers always have to be evolving and learning and evolving with the market and with e-commerce trends.
So this is the tool to help coach them, guide them.
Definitely.
And then how about for eBay overall, using a new tool like podcasting, how have you seen things like that evolve as a content marketer, which you are?
Well, and that it ties into our eBay for Business brand. So it's not just a podcast, it's a whole holistic story. So we've got the eBay for Business brand, we have the podcast that's part of it, we have a weekly Facebook live cast that we do that's part of the brand. We have other content we put out that ties into the community, and the good thing about it is we're a very integrated team, so we don't really have the battles maybe that some companies have, and we have a very small team, but we have a marketing manager that's pretty much embedded directly with us. She's on the editorial board. We coordinate on a weekly basis with marketing themes, and we kind of help tailor the content to that, but that's planned months, even quarters ahead. So there's a lot of planning that goes into what we do, and we have a studio on site. We do everything ourselves. We have some help with distribution via Libsyn, but it's very much an internal effort with a small but mighty team.
That's excellent. My last question, speaking of help with distribution, can you help me move my Diane von Furstenberg dress? I'm not getting pickup on it.
Well, we would tell you to
listen to the podcast.
Well, listen to the podcast, but take a look at your listing. Maybe it needs to be refreshed.
Okay. Don't
take it. This ties into another thing. There's a lot of seller myths and conspiracies out there. Don't take it down or relist it. Keep it up, but you might need to refresh it a little bit. Look at your title. Look at your description. Maybe even look at your photos. Look at similar stuff that's selling and see what's selling. Look at your price maybe, and look at the trends. You can go to explore.ebay.com and look at what's selling, but you can also search in there. So you can search for similar items that have sold and see the price range. So maybe you have to adjust your pricing. Maybe you have to, try some new photos.
Wow.
But the big thing is keep that listing up, because you've got that inherent singular URL that's really good for the search engines.
Everything you said sounds like one of those games where you replace the Chinese fortune cookie with a different word.
All right.
It sounds like everything you said about me selling that dress on eBay, I could also apply to marketing a podcast. So I'm going to do that. You taught me not only about eBay, and moving my dress, but also about marketing in general, and I think marketing a podcast.
Oh, great.
So,
That's awesome to hear.
yeah.
Thanks very much.
Doug Smith, you are community content manager at eBay.
Yes.
And this was brilliant.
All right.
Thanks for letting me grab
Thanks
you.
very much. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you. I'm talking to one of my favorite people in the industry because he has coached me in so many ways in the podcasting space back in the day. It's Steve Goldstein, who runs Amplify Media, a really great advisory for, well, anybody who wants to learn the space of podcasting and audio.
And it seems to be a thing.
It's a thing here, that's for sure, with like 3,000 people this year.
You know, I was at the second podcast movement, and it was in Fort Worth, Texas, I guess 5 years ago, also in the middle of the summer. But there were there were 6 radio people there, and I'm not kidding, 6. And now they're everywhere.
Everyone's here from
and all
radio.
the big companies, iHeart and
Yeah.
Intercom, all of them, of course.
Well, interestingly, the fact that I wanted to have a little bit of a theme to this of the more things change, the more are they changing? Radio is sort of the canary in the coal mine in podcasting now, I think.
Yeah, so absolutely. Look, television did this a couple of years ago. They shifted to on-demand. Nobody watches Grey's Anatomy at 8 o'clock on Thursday. They watch it whenever they want to. The notion that radio was going to somehow not participate in that is ludicrous. And there's so much great content that radio puts out that it gets broadcast and it goes to the dwarf planet Pluto, and that's the end of it. Insane that stuff wouldn't be available in an on-demand form. So that's table stakes for radio, the top of the list. Then you move into original content, and of course that to me is where the farming is being done now. And,
yes.
And so the broadcast companies are trying to figure out their way there, and the pure play podcasters are moving along at lightning speed.
Right. And the acquisition that we saw just recently with Intercom, Cadence 13, and Pineapple
Right.
Street, how does that help the radio industry and or hurt pure play podcast?
I don't think it, well, first of all, Cadence 13 was already almost 50% owned by Intercom. So
Right.
they just did what they should do, and they bought the rest of it as a sign that that broadcasters need to have an efficient podcast strategy. And so that makes all the sense in the world to me. And the iHeart deal, I think, is a fantastic deal with the How Stuff people.
Yeah.
And the integration there
Yep.
is very clear when you see iHeart starting to add podcasts to their schedule on the radio stations on Sunday night. Not the most popular time period, but a great first step to say, you know what, there is real potential
Yes.
integration between on-demand and linear.
Yes. We were both sitting in one of the panels today on branded content and branded podcasts, and Dave Beasing was interviewing everyone from Jack Daniels to eBay, and I just spoke with Doug Smith from eBay about their use of branded content. Tell me about what that looks like in the industry now.
So that is a huge growth category, probably about 10% according to the IAB of all the spend. So let's say there's about 700,000 spend today, and we know that's going up to $1 billion.
In terms of number of podcasts, 700,000 is...
No.
Well,
I'm
because
talking
there's
about
also
money.
700,000
right,
podcasts.
It's the same number.
Okay.
Weird.
All
isn't
right.
that?
About the podcast.
But the spending is about 10% of the spend is to branded content.
Oh.
And so that's the fantastic opportunity. We participate in that. We do production for companies in the branded sector, and there's a lot of bad content in that category because a lot of brands, I don't know who's going to listen to that stuff. So it's not an automatic that's a win.
Yes.
There are some brands like a Trader Joe's that has an audience that loves the store. I mean, we all know shoppers
Right.
who love to be inside Trader Joe's, and so they talk to their own constituency about things that are going on. They take people into the taste kitchen. They talk about why bananas are 19 cents each.
Yeah.
Those sorts of stories fit that brand. Not all brands can do that. And so you had the guy from eBay, perfect brand, where he's teaching people how to use his service. I love that idea. That
Right.
makes sense to me.
Right.
The Jack Daniels, sure, they have a core audience that loves that product. Talk to them.
Mm-hmm.
That sort of thing makes sense to me.
Got it.
And you'll see more of that.
And an interesting thing that came up, and as an advisor, Steve, a big issue remains, how do we measure this? And on that panel, we talked about the fact that you have to, as a creator of branded podcasts, make sure that you're managing the expectations of your client, because do they want to just reach that passionate fan like the Trader Joe's shopper, or are they trying to win a Cannes Lion, you know?
Yeah, so I think that there's all sorts of wins. I met a guy a couple of years ago here at Podcast Movement who took his love for podcasts and married it to his primary business. And his primary business is HVAC. He installs air conditioning systems. And you would think that that's crazy, except he talks to the 1,000 most important people in the HVAC business, and his sponsors are, I don't know who his sponsors are, but Trane, Carrier,
Right.
big companies. He doesn't need 10,000 people listening to that. He needs the right people listening to that. That's a different kind of content strategy. The branded thing is malleable to all these different angles as well. I don't think you're going to see too many of these hit the top of the charts.
Mm-hmm. Well, the one thing I think we could say about the HVAC guy is that he must be really cool. All right.
All right. And
Well,
soon to come is your own branded podcast. The comedy stylings
of EB Moss. Thank you. Thank you very much. Steve, thank you very much. I really enjoyed speaking with you, as always.
Good to see you. We'll see you again.
All right. Last but not least, I spoke to Jessica Kupferman, who co-founded She Podcasts. I've been listening to their podcast, and I've been a member of their Facebook group for the really specific and terrific embracing support that they offer female creators. She explains.
She Podcast is an online women's podcasting community that we started in 2014. It started out of the need to just sort of have some camaraderie and some mutual understanding from other podcasters without being sort of spoken to like how to all the time, but more we wanted someone that could relate to what we were going through and maybe give us advice through that. And that's sort of easier done with women. So we started it a long time ago. It now has 13,300 women in it. We also have a show called She Podcast that we've been doing for 5 years. And this year we were putting on our very first She Podcast live conference, where we have sold 450 tickets our first year.
450 tickets.
450 tickets. We sold half of those through a Kickstarter back in April. We did a Kickstarter to fund the event, just hoping that the community really meant it when they asked us to put on a conference just for us. And, I wanted to do that, but I also wanted to make sure they would come.
Yes.
So I didn't go in the hole. So we did a Kickstarter for $25,000 and we raised $50,000 and sold 200 tickets. So I think they want it. So it's good.
Good. And I know that you've also gotten some good sponsors behind it. Our
Great
friends from
sponsors.
Media Podcast Network are going to be there.
Mhm.
And can you drop some other names?
Midroll, PRX, Turner Network,
Warner Media Podcast Networks, right?
Warner Media Podcast
Yeah.
Networks. You're right. I'm sorry. Yes.
Old habits die hard.
Yes. Libsyn, Blueberry, Captivate, Edison Research, Triton Digital.
So I spoke to Tom earlier in this podcast episode, Tom from Edison Research. So one of the things that he talked about is the shifting audience of podcasting. So part of our theme today for this episode is the more things change, are they changing or staying the same? So let's talk about how things have shifted for women podcasters in the last 3 years.
So when I first started She Podcasts, there were about, I didn't know any other female guru types. I was taking advice from John Lee Dumas and Pat Flynn and Lewis Howes. And when I started the group, Elsie Escobar was there. She worked for Libsyn, and she had data from Libsyn that said that only 13% of podcasters were hosted by women, which seemed very, very low and kind of sad, actually.
Yes.
So now I just ran into Melissa Keish from Edison Digital downstairs, and she told me now it's 35%. Still not enough, though, I don't think. But part of the reason we are doing the conference is to sort of like push through the boundaries that women may have that men don't. Like, there might be a reason why there are less women-hosted shows than men. Fear of tech or time of day. As far as listeners, I think the reason that's grown is true crime. I mean, most women I know, if they do listen to podcasts, it's a true crime podcast. So that's a big part of it, I think.
So back to the numbers for just a second and some of the things that you've seen changing. I know, for example, you have a track at your conference about diversity and inclusion. But what have you seen change? We've seen women podcasters grow. What about people of color in general? What kind of uptake are you seeing? What shift have you seen?
So my partner Elsie Escobar just launched a podcast a couple of weeks ago called Sobre Podcasting, and I think I don't speak Spanish, but I believe it is a podcast about podcasting, and the only Spanish-speaking one. And she had a meetup here at Podcast Movement, and it was a full meetup, and there were podcasters from all different countries that have started to listen to it. She's already getting fan mail. So as far as who's creating content, that's definitely shifted from when she and I met. Also in the group, that was a majority white lady group for a very long time. And then slowly we started to see that shift. I do see that more people of color are creating, which I think is great, because those are the voices I think that feel like no one wants to listen, so therefore they don't bother, they don't try. I think that when it comes to conferences, especially Podcast Movement, last year or the year before was maybe 25% people of color. That's certainly risen this year. Our conference is 40%. And I think those voices are important. They're important for podcasting. They're important for those people to listen. I know that, again, Elsie's been pushing very hard for podcasting to be more accessible to people who may not have the technology to listen. That's very important as well. So slowly it is shifting in that direction. But I think with any tech, I think shift takes time.
Yes.
You know?
Yes. And hopefully shift happens, as they say.
Shift happens.
Okay.
Is that a t-shirt? I need to have that on a t-shirt.
Now. All right. Jessica Kupferman, she podcasts a whole movement, a conference, and helping
a lifestyle
shift more podcasters to empowering females.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Insider Insights from MediaVillage. I'm E.B. Moss. Rate, review, subscribe on Apple or wherever you listen to podcasts. And for a longer transcript of this show and more insights and thought leadership on media marketing and advertising, go to MediaVillage.com.